Welcome to the Decipher podcast. I'm Dennis Fisher here with my colleague Lindsey O'Donnell-Welch, just back from Black Hat, and we thought we'd do a little wrap-up podcast to talk about what we saw in Vegas and what we liked, maybe what we didn't like. It was a pretty hectic week for both of us, Linz. We saw each other, but not all that much, kind of like passing in the hotel hallway or like handing off a, a key to get into the video recording suite or whatever it was. But it was still a pretty fun week for me.
Yeah, I always have a great time at that conference. Just seeing people, like everyone's going to be there, so that's good.
Yeah.
And I did make it to like one or two of the sessions, so that the ones that I saw, I was pretty had some really unique takeaways, and it was good to see people present in person about some of the issues that we write about every day. So
Yeah, it's true. It is almost one of those things where you're writing about this work that everybody does all the time, and then we obviously know a lot of these people, but there's other people that you haven't met before, and you see them in person. You're like, oh, that's right, you're a real person. You're not just like hands on a keyboard in some remote place.
I know it's funny too, like you see people like looking at your badge and being like, "Oh, you're
Yes.
Lindsey O'Donnell-Welch." Like, so you just see people's names like all over Twitter or the internet, and
Yeah.
then seeing them in person and being semi creepy, like me being creepy to others because I'm like, I wrote about some research that you that you were
Yes.
talking about last week. So it's
Well,
just
we did have one of those fun interactions. We were standing in the hotel like hallway lobby, and somebody came up to both of us. We were just talking to each other, and somebody came up and was like, "Oh, you're Dennis and Lindsay." And I was like, "Oh boy, I don't know who you are." And thankfully, she introduced herself, and I was like, "Oh God, that's right. We did a podcast like 6 months ago." But
yeah.
it was very. She was not wearing a badge, and I looked at you and had absolute panic on my face, and you had the same. You're like, I hope you know who that is because I don't.
Yeah, I know.
Happens
Always.
all the time, but
Yeah.
it's one of the fun things about that. Okay, so let's go through a few of the talks that we liked. Let's start off with you, Linz. What was one that you wanted to kind of highlight?
Yeah. So, and we actually, in our preview podcast that we did with Brian from Red Canary, which everyone, if you're interested, go listen or watch that because it was fun to record. But we talked about this is one of the ones that we were excited about, but Google's Project Zero. Natalie Silvanovich with Project Zero gave a talk about 10 years of Project Zero and kind of how the understandings of 0 days have changed and the interactions with vendors.
Yeah,
And it was pretty fascinating, like just hearing how things have changed over the years. And she covered kind of four big areas, which was the how the quality of software has changed, how patching has changed, how transparency has changed, and mitigations have changed. And talked about how the research community has had a pretty significant impact, obviously. Outlined some anecdotes and contextual stories, like
yeah,
everything with Flash, how kind of security researchers and other factors led to, partly the deprecation of that over time. So it was kind of a nice little like history thing, but then she also talked about where we're at today with those four issues. And obviously we still have a lot of work to do. There's still 0 days out there, and there's still a lot of kind of not issues with like transparency and
yeah.
like things like that. So she called upon like vendors to also try to play a part in where we're at going forward. And one other interesting thing she outlined in the talk too was, we have those issues with software patching, transparency, and mitigation, but this new thing, it's called, she labeled it security gap, but I know there's like a bunch of other terms for it. But this new issue of security gap has kind of come up as well. And that's kind of looking at this area of like middleware, which is firmware software that's sold to upstream vendors, and that threat actors are really starting to target a lot more. So she said
Yeah.
that's kind of a new ish issue that we're now seeing as well.
Yeah, the software quality part of that is interesting to me because I think software quality has gone up over time, but not enough to have really broken the cycle of very bad vulnerabilities we don't see as many memory safety or memory corruption bugs these days, at least in major software packages. They're still out there and they get unearthed every once in a while, but they're not quite as common as they were, say 8 or 10 years ago. But we still see plenty of kind of really pernicious bugs that get widely exploited. So, um, you know, I, I know some people are pinning their hopes on automation and AI to do something with that, but there's been automation in software development for a long time. I don't know that AI is necessarily going to solve that problem for us. I guess we'll see how it goes, but most of the smart people I know that have looked at that don't hold a lot of hope for that. It's I don't know what the answer is, but I'm not positive that AI is it.
Yeah. I guess we'll have to see about that. But to your point about software quality, like that was something that I noticed was discussed a lot, which it's nothing
Yeah.
new. But like Jen Easterly with CISA talked a lot about software quality and viewing vulnerabilities as defects as opposed to
Hmm.
calling them vulnerabilities. I didn't go to that session, but I was reading about it and I was like, that makes sense. And I know also, Moxie Marlinspike with Signal also talked a little bit about kind of software issues. So, and you went to that keynote, right?
Yeah, I did. I did. It was very cool because I mentioned it in our preview podcast, and I think I said that he hasn't been at Black Hat in quite a while, at least speaking publicly. He may have been there as an attendee, I'm not sure, but he hasn't spoken at Black Hat in quite a while. So I was really excited, and when I got in there, I was sitting next to a friend of ours who's a security researcher, and we're both, what is he going to talk about? And we had no idea. And then he came out and he did this extremely cool talk that was just basically like this really long, like 30-minute analogy metaphor, I'm not really sure, about sort of real world stuff and software development and engineering, and how um, vision and engineering need to really converge in software development to make things better. He used a lot of like Harry Potter analogies. I've never read those books, never seen the movies. I have no idea what he was talking about.
I'm the
It's
opposite. I love that.
okay. You should have been in there then. It was totally after my time. I didn't get any of it, but his general point was, over the course of time, we've gotten a lot more software, but it hasn't really gotten better. And a lot of what we've gotten is pretty bad. There's a very large chunk of crap out there. The highest level stuff being developed by, professional organizations is really good. But there's plenty of organizations just developing stuff really quickly, and it's not very good. And that sort of leads to this whole problem of security vulnerabilities because you're rushing through the process and you're going to make mistakes. Even with automated tools and code scanning and all those kind of things, bugs are gonna slip through.
Mhm.
And his larger point for the security audience was, what you all in this room do is really, really important, and more important than ever because of all of this. We need you guys to look through all of these layers of abstraction and all of this stuff that's out there to find these problems and get them fixed before the bad guys find them, which is, a pretty tall task. But it was ended up essentially being kind of a, not a pep talk, but like, keep going, you're doing good work type of thing, which I think is always nice for folks in a really difficult, you know, sometimes harrowing job to hear. If you're somebody that's doing IR or something like that, and your brain is getting fried every every 3 weeks with a new incident, it's always nice to hear somebody say what you do matters.
Yeah, that just shows that he really knows and he gets it. Because I feel
Yeah.
like one thing when I was talking to a lot of people about the top issues in the security space right now, and this again is nothing new, but like burnout was like just kept kind of coming up, just like
Hmm.
you know being overworked or kind of dealing with the continuous grind of incidents and kind of everything that goes with that, and certainly applies at the CISO level, but then all the way down, I think, to teams and trying to deal with that. I think it's a tricky situation.
Yeah,
Yeah. So
no doubt.
yeah. Um, all right. Well, one other session I went to that I thought was interesting was the one. it was by Richard Herring, who's principal security architect with NVIDIA. And he was talking about the security issues in LLMs, but he was coming from kind of the architect engineering standpoint of how
Yeah.
these things actually work. So AI, was talked about a bit, I would say, at the show overall, but like I think it was interesting because it seems like the conversations had evolved a little bit from, at least from my standpoint, from RSA, where they were, I think it was a little more from a generalized level at RSA, or maybe like, what does this mean for like data governance or for company
Right.
policies? But at Black Hat, and I think this session exemplified that, it was a lot of, what's the actual risks in the LLMs themselves? Like, what can we do about that? And what Richard was saying in his session was that, a lot of these LLMs are kind of inherently unreliable.
Yes.
And, we have to design around the model's failure or unreliability, because they're just kind of built that way, right?
Hmm.
So, um, yeah, so he mapped out a lot of, he had, anyone who is watching should kind of, the presentations are available on Black Hat's website now, but like
Yeah.
go check out his presentation because he had a really good map of the input vectors for LLMs, and then he pointed out specifically, hey, this is where this input vector could potentially lead to this vulnerability or security risk.
Yeah.
So that was cool to see it mapped out to that level. And yeah, it was a great talk. I didn't write about it, but I definitely learned a couple of good things during that one.
Yeah, that sounds very cool to me. There are people, a lot of the noise we've heard about around AI and security is in a couple of specific areas, like adversarial inputs on LLMs or things like that, which, yeah, that those things matter, but there's a lot of just underlying problems with them that not everybody is really digging into yet. So I'm glad to see that somebody is looking at that kind of stuff. And there's, it sort of goes back to the conversation I had with Gary McGraw last week on the podcast about, recursive data pollution and data feudalism in machine learning and AI, two of the bigger problems that are still out there. So, yeah, that's cool to hear. The other topic, I guess it wasn't a talk, but it was one of the video interviews that I did, or a couple of them that touched on the same topic, um, talking about how, even though you were just talking about the Project Zero stuff and 0 days and, exploits matter and that kind of stuff, and we're still working on the 0 day problem, how many of the larger attacks that we hear about these days really don't involve an exploit at all? They often are just a long social engineering campaign that involves a lot of reconnaissance ahead of time, targeting an employee, gathering some more information from them, maybe a fake help desk call, a password reset, all of that kind of stuff that never really involves actually exploiting a vulnerability in a software package or application or website. You're going back to the very old school and exploiting, human weaknesses. This is essentially what Scattered Spider does in most of their attacks. It's what a lot of the cybercrime groups do because a lot of them don't have the technical expertise to develop exploits or things like that. A lot of times they're buying initial access to networks. So I was talking to the chief scientist at Rapid 7 who was making this point. He's like, look, we just don't see that many bugs being exploited in the wild. Yes, we do all the research on them and we want to get the information out there to people that have these apps or things exposed to the internet just in case. But a lot of the attacks are simpler than that. They're just these kind of combination social engineering campaigns going after identity providers and things like that just you know it's a different world right now than it has been for the last few years, I think.
Yeah, and the scattered spider attacks part of that too, that stuck out to me because it really is, really difficult to kind of defend against some of the
Yeah.
processes that they were using. I mean, and the processes they were abusing, right? They were calling third party help desks in some cases, saying, pretending to be people based on data that they had compromised, and
Yep.
essentially able to kind of help with their initial access in that manner. So how do you, you know, go from, if you're a targeted organization, how do you talk to your help desk and to say, like, don't do that? So
I
it's just
know.
because it's a lot of it is really sprawled in terms of the nature of how they're carrying out these attacks. It's really difficult to defend against.
It definitely is. And it shows you just how much research and reconnaissance these groups do before they launch one of these campaigns. They know what third party help desk provider you're using. They know what software that provider is using for their help desk. They know what identity provider you're using. They know what 2FA you're using. They knew, if you use Outlook 365, if you use, G Suite, if you use something else. So they have all this information and they're able to essentially like play the part of one of the, of a help desk employee or of an employee looking for help. So it's really tough. It's a tough situation for defenders right now. There's no question about it.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, and the other piece of that too is just the fact that, in some attacks, like, threat actors will be laying low for a while. It's not
yeah,
There's not just one playbook of an attack, and they'll just kind of wait for the right time and place, and then launch their attack. So I think it's really difficult.
yeah. Any other like big overarching themes that came out of maybe the conversations you were having with video um, interviewees or just in the hallways last week?
I talked to a couple of CISOs like Wendy Nather and Merritt Bear, Netta Pitt, who was with Belk. And, one thing I talked earlier about burnout, but like one other thing that kind of came up, which was interesting to me, was, post pandemic challenges, which I thought was interesting because, we're 4 years out of COVID now, but obviously the way that environments have shifted over the past 4 years, going fully remote and now hybrid and then somewhere in between. That was something that is still pretty heavily, seems like it's impacting how organizations are, how they're approaching their security for their own
Definitely.
internal environments. So that was something that kind of surprised me, I guess, what that came up. And yeah, other than that, there was a lot of talk, obviously, around kind of identity, like we were just talking about. A lot of the issues that are popping up of how threat actors are approaching their attacks.
Yep.
So yeah, lots of good conversation there.
Yeah, I had similar ones with a few CISOs that I know, just like informal conversations over the week, not about the remote work part of it, but about how difficult and like mentally challenging the CISO job is now. It's not just managing budgets and headcount and what apps and tools are we going to buy and that sort of thing. It's also, am I going to get sued for making a decision at some point or potentially prosecuted?
Yeah.
And, we've seen both of those things happen multiple times in the last couple of years. So a lot of those folks that I was talking to, they're, you know, if they've been in the job for more than 3 or 4 years, they just have kind of this like 1,000 yard stare of, what's coming next, like what bad thing is coming at me next, which I think is just working in security anyway. But right now, specifically, the CISOs seem to be really under a lot of stress, and I don't know how that's going to get better anytime soon for them, unfortunately.
I know liability was something that has really been talked about even in sessions themselves at conferences. So I think it is top of mind for CISOs right now, and also with the SEC cyber rules.
Yeah.
We're a few months in on those now too, and I think there's been a lot of close looking at how that's going to impact, who's responsible should the SEC decide to kind of follow up on any of those the,
Oh,
the
they're gonna.
yeah, yeah. So,
Definitely. Yeah. All right. Well, another black hat in the books. It was great to see you last week. And thanks to everybody for listening. Talk to you soon, Linz.
awesome. Thank you.